Hello and welcome back to what I believe is going to be the last installment on junk science, which is Existential Threat to America number 6. Here I just have a whole bunch of odds and ends that I'm tying together to try to illustrate what I said in the previous installments on this topic. There's so much here, I'm just going to have to get straight to it and move as fast as I possibly can. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is to look for patterns and overlap among all the different topics that are related to junk science as I discuss these things. For example, evolution, Big Bang, eugenics, genocide, abortion, communism, and any kind of dictatorship by some so-called intellectual elite, which, cults, that kind of thing. Darwin, Hitler, the Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin trio of Soviet Union, Chairman Mao, Castro, anti-smoking, climate change, public health in general, the idea of public health being used as a powerful political force of unelected people who are kept at a safe distance from the people who they're tyrannizing. There's several degrees of separation between the person in junk science who causes these regulations and rules and laws and taxes and oppressions and the person who's being oppressed. So just look for where all these things kind of overlap with each other. If you don't understand that, then you're going to probably come out of this just thinking that junk science only affects anti-smoking and climate change and Big Bang Theory and evolution. That is not the case. Those are really the four I'm focusing on in this series, but it affects almost every field of science out there. It doesn't matter what. I'm going to touch on a couple others here. The overall overriding theme here, though, that you're going to see is that this crazy idea that academia is composed of some kind of intellectual elites, and these people are civilized superiors, and they deserve to live, they deserve to prosper, but the unwashed savages, they are, they're the ones who the intellectual elite needs to control. They need to tell them what to do. They need to, illuminate them, because they can't take care of themselves. If you look at King James, A Counterblast to Tobacco, the document that started the anti-smoking movement, which in the 20th century became an industry, he refers to the reason he hates tobacco. If you read it, it's pretty clear. It's because it came from the, quote, godless savages, as he called them. They really like to use that word savage, and before political correctness, they weren't afraid to use it at all. Since political correctness, they have started using other terminology to get around that, but they're saying exactly the same thing. Junk scientists, some of them are just doing it for their own purposes, their own careers. They're too lazy, they're too gutless, they don't have any morality, they're just amoral. They don't really care, it's a job to them, they're not really interested in the world particularly. Runs the gamut from that all the way up to people who are total megalomaniacs, and they just want to dictate the terms of existence for every other person on earth, if at all possible, without being elected to office again. So, for example, Michael Bloomberg, right? Michael Bloomberg, when he smoked, everyone could smoke. Once he stopped smoking, every person on the face of the earth must stop smoking. He runs for mayor of New York, never mentions anything about anti-smoking. He gets elected to office, and bam, instantly, he imposes a smoking ban on some 12, 15 million human beings who are his equal, but he doesn't see it that way. I'm Michael Bloomberg. If I can't smoke, nobody can. When I could smoke, it was perfectly fine. Alright. Another person who did the exact same thing came out of Germany in the mid-20th century. He was a smoker. Then he quit smoking. Once he quit smoking, he said, you can't smoke either. His name was Adolf Hitler. Now the difference there is that his army was filled with smokers. So he could not prosecute the World War II without those smokers. So what he did was he invented the core tactics and techniques of the modern anti-smoking industry, which is propaganda and human manipulation based. But if you think those ovens and the death camps were not going to be fired up to help cleanse what remained of the German citizens, then you don't understand Hitler, and you don't understand the Nazi Party, and you don't understand the junk science that Hitler relied on to get where he was going. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish doctor. He was in one of the concentration camps in World War II. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's worth checking out. He concluded that the gas chambers of Auschwitz were ultimately prepared at the desks and the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. The gas chambers of Auschwitz, in other words, eugenics, genocide. It was prepared by scientists. And this goes back to Darwin, but it branches off into a lot of other things. Hitler went after smokers very aggressively, and it is a pretty sure bet. The evidence seems to show that once the war was over, he was going to take some pretty strong action against them, as in, if you smoke, you're dead. That kind of thing. When he smoked, it was fine. Once he stopped, everyone else must stop. Just like Michael Bloomberg. In fact, exactly, identically like Michael Bloomberg, who's running for president of the United States. Here's the Nazi eugenics poster. I'm just going to show you one. It's all I have handy. There's plenty more. You can't really read it, but basically what it's doing is it's showing this fella in a wheelchair. He is what we used to call a cripple. Political correctness doesn't let us call him that, but I'm going to do it anyway. The poor guy, he has some problems. He has some disabilities. He's crippled. The sign is talking about how much money he costs society. The reason they're trying to use propaganda to bring this awareness about amongst the unwashed hordes of, ignorant masses, as Hitler would call them, or probably Bloomberg as well. I mean, they did exactly the same thing, right, with smoking, so I imagine they'd say the same thing. The reason they did all that propaganda was because they wanted to plant in people's minds this idea, and they understand perfectly. They understand human manipulation. It's going to take time. You repeat it, just like Hitler said with the big lie. You can be the most ridiculous lie on the face of the earth. It could be climate change. It could be Big Bang. Nothing exploded, boom, into everything. It could be the most ridiculous, something that a child can figure out is utter nonsense. But if you repeat it over and over and over, and if you can get people wearing lab coats to say it, and people with a PhD, and if you just keep, escalating that higher and higher using peer pressure and other tactics, and maybe even some threats to get people in positions of power and authority and prestige to keep repeating this, eventually the masses will come to believe anything. It's right there in Mein Kampf. Hitler wrote down exactly what he was going to do, and that's exactly what he did, with the help of his propaganda minister, Goebbels. But also with the help of his scientists. Remember, every doctor in Germany was a member of the Nazi Party in good standing, by definition. Every doctor. Building the Aryan race. This poster sets the stage for the idea that if you see somebody who is, quote, inferior by somebody's standard, apparently by these megalomaniac standards, right? Since there is no objective standard, this cripple is inferior. This Jew is inferior. Okay? They're costing us money. They're costing society money with all of their filth, with the disease that they spread, with all the government assistance that goes to keeping this useless, bag of bones alive. Maybe it'd be better, maybe it would be merciful if we just kill them. It's called genocide. Hitler also thought smokers fit into that class, even though he was a smoker once too, but you see how this works. When you're dealing with junk science, you're not dealing with the cream of the intellectual crop. the reason I show you that particular sign is because what have they done with all these things, from climate change, anti-smoking, all these, that is common propaganda today, to come out with stories and posters and advertisements, PSAs, public service announcements, that claim that so-and-so is costing us this much money. This drug epidemic is costing this much money. Forget the human suffering, which is what really matters. Okay? Smoking, this one smoker is costing you $11,000 in taxes. There's no way to prove that. It's just made up out of whole cloth, but hey, it sounds pretty scary. Maybe we should get rid of the smokers, one way or another, right? Climate change, you're destroying the whole planet. That's going to cost your family, $284,000. I just made that up, just like the climate change people do. Let's take a look at Origin of Species, the book that Darwin used to kick off this evolution craze. And I mean crazy. You know, they talk about the origin of species all the time. What they don't really tend to tell you is the subtitle of the book. Let me give you the whole title of Origin of Species. It is called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The preservation of favored races. For example, I'm just guessing here, but I suspect probably whichever race Charles Darwin is a member of is probably considered a favored race by Charles Darwin. And if I look that up, yeah, that is exactly what happened. What a coincidence. The race that Charles Darwin is a member of just happens to be the superior race. Man, that almost sounds like Hitler. You know, which is interesting because Hitler got so much of his ideas about eugenics and genocide, you know, getting rid of Jews and smokers and things, he got that from Charles Darwin. The father of modern evolution theory, the one that's being taught to your children, the one that's being justified to commit horrific atrocities all over the place. Every one of these lunatics in the Soviet Union, Chairman Mao, Cambodia, all these places, ultimately they are led by evolution. The idea that we are not made in the image of God, we have no value. That's the intellectual cream of the crop at the top running the show, with guns, by the way, violence. Apparently to them that's the best of the best, people who use violence and manipulation and propaganda and such. They're allowed to live, they decide who lives and dies. You're going to see this over and over and over. Just replace lives and dies with who will be taxed, who will have their children taken away, who is going to be forced at gunpoint to get shot up with a vaccine when they don't know what's in there. It's their body. Now, if you step outside this door and walk into the other door, there's a woman in there saying, "This is my body. I have every right to murder this baby that's in my belly, that's there because I went out and had some fun one night, and now I don't want to pay the consequences of that. So it's my body, so I get to murder a human being that I'm responsible for." And then you walk back from that door into my room, and they're sitting there with a gun to your head saying, "Paul, you're going to take this vaccine." And I say, "But it's my body. I have the choice of what I do with it." And they're like, "No, we're the government. We tell you what to do." Perhaps you see the contradictions here. This all stems from evolution, where there is no objective morality. We're all just a bunch of DNA pets just running around. Evolution supporters have made all kinds of spurious claims. I'm reading this wrong. Evolution supporters claim that those who oppose evolution are making spurious claims when they claim that Darwin himself was sexist or racist. Okay? So, in other words, if you support evolution and someone comes along and says, "Yeah, but Darwin was a racist. He was coming up with a theory that put him at the top of the evolutionary chain, and therefore he had some kind of, he thought, moral right to determine what's going on with others. You know, who lives and who dies." And they call that spurious. Well, let's listen to Darwin's own words, shall we? Because unless Darwin was prone to just writing out things that other people thought and putting his own name stamp on it in his own books, I'm going to make what I think is a reasonable assumption that these words written by Darwin, published in his book, reflects what Darwin himself actually believed. Let's take a look at racism. This is from a book called The Descent of Man by Charles Darwin. In there he says, and I quote, "At some future period, not very distant, as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, his state, the Caucasian, the Aryan, Darwin, Hitler, and as we may hope, even the Caucasian, his group generally, and some ape as low as a baboon. Instead of as now, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. In other words, by exterminating the inferior races, such as the Negro or the Australian, and exterminating the apes that seem a little too human for comfort, like the gorilla or the orangutan or something, if you exterminate all that, then you've got this huge gap between what's left, which are the superior race, the Caucasians, the white people. Darwin was white, you see. And the next highest monkey that'll be left, which is probably something like a baboon, which doesn't look a whole lot like a human, does it? But no, Darwin wasn't racist at all. Not at all. Also, they say that it's spurious to claim that Darwin was sexist. Let's look in the same book from Charles Darwin. This is his own words from The Descent of Man. Darwin says, and I quote, "The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes," and he claims there's two sexes, not 100 of them, not an infinite number. You just decide what sex you are. Today I'm going to be a black baseball cap gender, like these people are teaching. Darwin himself said there's two sexes, unless I'm reading this wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, because the people who follow Darwin are claiming something else. You see where I'm going. Let's see. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses in hand. It goes on to say, the average mental power in man must be above that of woman. He goes on to say again, man has ultimately become superior to woman. That's from Darwin's own mouth. Maybe some filthy smoker or someone who denies climate change snuck into his study and put a gun to his head and said, "Darwin, I want you to write this. I want you to write this. All right, I want you to put your own stamp on it." Maybe he wrote it against his will. Maybe that's what happened, because that's about as plausible as nothing going boom and becoming everything, isn't it? Looks to me like Darwin was both racist, extremely racist, talking about extermination for heaven's sakes, and sexist. From his theory of evolution comes all the nonsense we've had. The basis of Nazism, eugenics, genocide, everything I mentioned at the beginning. Communism, Soviet Union. Alright. Elsewhere, where he's talking more about his theory itself rather than his philosophy on life, which is so enlightening, elsewhere, Darwin said things to the effect of, if you can't prove this, if this doesn't happen, then my theory is garbage. For example, if you can't find, there should be hundreds of thousands of these fossils, transitory, just all kinds of fossils everywhere between man and gorilla. Just hundreds, thousands, millions of them maybe. If you don't find those, then my theory is crap. Well, we haven't found any. Oops. If Darwin himself was intellectually honest, even if you take his philosophy of hating other people, he was a very angry guy. If you take his philosophy of hating other races and women away, if he was intellectually honest today, if he looked at his own theory, he would say, I was wrong. He would say everything they have learned since I wrote this book has gone against evolution. In fact, it seems to confirm the idea of an intelligent designer, some kind of a creation, if he was intellectually honest. And you know what? Same is true for these junk scientists today. If they were intellectually honest, they would have to say the same thing, but they don't. They are not intellectually honest. Pull out that one word. They are not honest. Remember what I said in other videos. Junk scientists lie. You seeing the overlap now a little bit? Here's another topic. The dinosaurs. Dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, according to people who call themselves scientists. 65 million years ago. They did not die out 64 million years ago. Okay, and they did not die out 66 million years ago. They died out 65 million years ago. And the scientists know this for a fact, you see. Boo! How do they know this? Well, I really don't have time to go into great detail, but let's take a quick look at geology. Geology is the study of rocks, rock formations, how the earth is, layered and built and such. Tectonics, the volcano, all that kind of stuff. One of the founders of geology, a guy named Lyell, he came right out and said in his writings that his goal in formulating this new science is to remove God from science. That was his purpose. The problem with that is, what if God did create everything? Since he can't prove that God didn't, what if God did create everything? That means that by deliberately removing God, what he does for the rest of his life in this field, and what he trains everyone else to do for the rest of their lives, from the first time they crack open a book in kindergarten until they die at 100 years old with all their Nobel Prizes, their lives were completely and utterly wasted on absolute nonsense that has nothing to do with reality, if God was in fact the creator. But that didn't stop him, because apparently he just had a problem with God. He wasn't looking for the truth, you see. He says himself to remove God from science is his goal. That's where geology came from. Is it any surprise that the rocks are millions and millions of years old? You see, geology makes an assumption, well, it makes several, but one in particular called Uniformitarianism. And what that basically means is that whatever processes you see going on right now, it has always been that way. It was never different. All right? So if it is, if this is the air pressure, and this is your elevation, and this is the temperature, and you take a chicken egg and you crack it open and drop it from exactly 6 inches onto a ceramic plate, the egg should fall down there and it should spread out in a certain way. And if you go back 1 trillion years and you do the same thing under the same circumstances, the egg's going to hit and it's going to fall out. In theory, it should, well, it probably wouldn't because it's a different egg, but it's going to basically make the exact same pattern, right? Another way of looking at it is, well, if we do, say, some kind of radiometric dating, carbon-14 dating or something, or radiometric dating, if we were assuming that, what that is basically you have some radioactive element, it has a half-life, so it loses half of its radioactivity within a certain period of time. All right? And then it loses the other half, and then the other half, and then the other half, and the other half, and eventually it's just gone. There is no more radioactivity. It's all dissipated, right? Well, right now you can kind of calculate what the half-life is. So if you measure the carbon content of, well, not carbon, carbon's another story, it doesn't go back far enough. Carbon dating doesn't help one bit with any of this stuff. Carbon dating isn't even capable of looking back millions of years. The half-life is too short. The carbon would all be gone after about 100,000 years. So it's useless for that. But for the other radiometric dating schemes, they're making an assumption that the half-life was always the same. When you crack the chicken egg, it'll fall on the plate and spread out the same way 1 trillion years ago as it does today, under the same circumstances. They're making that assumption, but you know what? They have no idea. They don't know that. And again, what if there was a creator who might kind of stir things up a bit. Because he wants you to have faith in him. So maybe he creates the conditions where somebody who willfully decides to throw God out of their life can just do things like make an assumption like uniformitarianism. Maybe God created a world like that to help identify who really loves God and who hates him. Because when you have that big of a divide, you start to understand why one group is going to one eternal destination and the other one deserves to go to the other eternal destination, don't you? It's a possibility. I'm not saying that's the case. I believe it is. Can't prove it. But it's a possibility. And that possibility alone means that uniformitarianism is nothing more than an assumption. And that means that any conclusions that derive from that are utterly useless. They don't mean anything, because you can't know if your assumption was right in the first place. And if you can't know that, then you've done nothing. You've done absolutely nothing. So using that radiometric dating, which the assumption behind it is an assumption and nothing more, using that, they come to their conclusions that rocks are millions and millions and millions of years old, okay? So basically though, if you want to know how old a dinosaur is, if you go to a natural history museum, you go to one end of the museum, right? And they have all the rock layers, and they're showing all the sedimentary layers, and here's the geological history of the Earth. It goes back millions and millions and millions of years, and some little small child raises her hand and says, how do you know how old the rocks are? And the person who calls himself a scientist is going to say, well, that's a good question. What we do is we find fossils of animals like dinosaurs in here, in the rock. All right? And since we know how old the fossils are, we know how old the rocks are that it's found in. And the kid goes, oh, okay. And then they go and they look at the rest of the museum, and they stop in the center at the food court, and they get some souvenirs, buy some of these people who call themselves scientists books and things like that. And then they go to the other side of the museum, 4 hours later, and oh, there's the dinosaur bones. And they have a brontosaurus all built up there, all the bones and everything. Well, most of them, because they can't seem to find complete skeletons very often, which you would expect to find if it, hadn't been washed away in a flood or something like that. If it had just died in place, you would expect another story entirely. So the person who calls himself a scientist over here is saying, telling about the dinosaurs, well, they died out 65 million years ago, and the little kid raises her hand and says, well, how do you know how old the fossils are? Well, that's a good question, little kid. It's really easy, actually. You see, you look in the rock layers, where in the rock layers you find the fossil, and you just take the age of the rock, and you know how old the fossil is. At that point, most kids, at least through the American education system, would say, okay, and they go back and get some more souvenirs. But a kid who thinks might say, the problem is there, sir, at the other end of the museum, the guy told me that they determined the age of the fossil, or they determined the age of the rock by just taking what they know is the age of the fossil and they apply it to the rock. Now you're telling me the other way around. Now you're telling me that they get the age of the fossil by taking the age of the rock and applying it to the fossil. So where does the age itself actually get attributed to any of this stuff? You're doing circular reasoning here. And that's when they say, well, sorry, you got to go now. We got another group coming in. This is a good question. Thank you very much for coming today. Don't forget to stop at the souvenir shop and spend some money. That's the way it usually goes. At best, where they get this idea of how old the rocks are comes from radiometric dating, which means nothing. Because it assumes uniformitarianism. It's an assumption. It doesn't mean anything. That is too big of an assumption. People could be wasting their entire lives, their entire careers on a lie if uniformitarianism is wrong. If that's how you want to spend your life calling yourself a scientist, more power to you. I prefer to look for the truth or to just say, I don't know. Rule number one of science, I told you early on, is that we can't know everything. And anybody who claims that they're going to know it anyway, even if they have to just make it up or come up with some ludicrous explanation, they're a junk scientist. So when you take all this stuff, you take the dinosaurs, the supposed millions of years, how old we are, human evolution throughout those millions of years, even though there's no fossil records showing transitions. There's no evidence at all. There's nothing. There's nothing. Look up the coelacanth. Don't have time to talk about it now. Coelacanth, classic example of this. That helps to explain, since these institutions, these political parties, communists, fascists, Hitler, people like this, are following this idea, this crazed, unsubstantiated idea that everything is millions of years old and we just evolved out of the sludge and there is no objective morality. Whoever is in charge, whoever takes control, they determine, they dictate, I should say, what morality is. And the next dictator might completely believe something completely different. No rhyme or reason to anything, but who cares, because the only thing that matters are the intellectual elite who are in charge. They just get to have good, comfortable lives, while everyone else, if they're allowed to live, they just live in misery, the unwashed masses. All of this comes from these ridiculous ideas, evolution, Big Bang, and such. From that comes absolutely barbaric human experimentation, and we're familiar with it in the Nazis, of course, sewing twins together, and the things they did, taking out, lymph tissue from children. Yeah, they did it with children. They didn't care. They didn't care. All this crap about saving the children, it has never been about saving the children. These people don't care about children. They murder 50 million of them in America in the belly, in the womb. They don't care about children. There's so much medical malpractice. I mean, aside from war and just terror of genocides and such, the Inquisition, the Crusades, aside from that, in terms of so-called legitimate fields, nothing has been more deadly throughout human history than medicine. And if you think that's different today, then you don't understand history. Because all through history, the doctors of that time, whatever time it was, said, well, we're the height of knowledge. We know what our ancestors didn't know. It's settled science, nothing to learn in the future. We know it. Now get over here so I can put some leeches on you. Like they did to George Washington. When George Washington basically caught a cold, might have had something a little more serious, they bled him to death. The first president of the United States, the founder of the country, he was essentially killed by his doctor, who bled him because they thought that was going to help. They thought they were the height of medicine. They knew it all. The people today, just because they have television sets, they have access to broadcast media, just because they have cell phones, just because they wear lab coats now to try to look cool, and they came up with this idea of a PhD meaning something, awards, Nobel Prizes, Pulitzer Prizes, all these things, just because all that exists today doesn't mean anything. It's the same thing it has been since ancient times. At whatever time you're at, the scientists say, we're the height of human knowledge, there's nothing more to learn, we know it all. We know so much about DNA, that's why we're just going to call all this 98% of it we don't understand, we're just going to call it junk. It's a vestige from when we crawled around on our knuckles. Because we know it all. So don't even bother studying DNA, because, in the future, the next trillion years or so, don't even bother looking at it. We know it's junk. Don't even bother. We figured it all out. That was what, maybe 20, 30 years ago? And yet you think your doctor knows something? You got a lot to learn, people. You got a lot to learn. Doctors kill more people than any other field. Yeah, including the tobacco industry. Because you can demonstrate that the tobacco industry, you can demonstrate, like as in proof, cause and effect, you can demonstrate nothing. You can't demonstrate a single person who has died from smoking tobacco. You can't demonstrate it. You can assume it. You can create some circumstantial case against it and appeal to people's emotions in a jury box and have them award $500 million to someone who got cancer. But you can't prove it because there's no demonstration that one person has ever suffered cancer, emphysema, heart disease because they smoked or because they were around that. Ever. But doctors? No. I'll give you 3 examples myself. My grandfather, killed by his doctor. My other grandfather, killed by his doctor. My sister, killed by the neglect of her doctors. There's 3 examples right there. How many can you think of? Doctors are not what you think they are. You might want your daughter to marry one because they make a lot of money, but they're not as smart as they think they are. And that goes for the so-called doctors in academia as well, the ones who don't actually do anything. The researchers, the theoretical this and that, the people who publish these ridiculous journals. Along those lines comes something like a field like epidemiology. Epidemiology is supposed to be basically studying patterns and looking for what they call determinants. They love to use these big words, determinants. If you ask someone what is epidemiology, they'll probably throw the word determinant in there 3 or 4 times. Look back to my previous video about how to spot a junk scientist. Hypothesis, hypothesis, hypothesis. Determinants, determinant. You see what I'm saying? Whatever. They basically do what a small child would do when they're successful. Epidemiology always harkens back to their so-called founding, right? There was a cholera epidemic in Soho, England, and it was killing off everybody. So it was a doctor, a physician or what have you. He plotted the points of where all these deaths were occurring, all these sicknesses were occurring, and he looked for some commonality there, and he found that, well, there's 2 wells there in those concentrations. They're supplied by the same company. Maybe the water coming through those wells has something in it that's causing this disease. They didn't really understand what germs were, but he made that assumption. So what he did was he went and he got the water cleaned, he replaced the handles and what have you, put chlorine in the water, and what do you know, the epidemic went away. Now, epidemiologists they'll put it up on a chair. There's 6 guys with poles holding this example, parading through the streets. Look at us! This is how we were formed. This is where epidemiology came from. What a success story. The problem is, would you please tell me where the science is in that? Would you please tell me? The guy looked at where people were getting sick, plotted them on a map, thought about it for a second, and came up with an idea that a 10-year-old kid could figure out. Well, gee, they're all, look at this, the well's right in the middle of it. Maybe it's something to do with the water coming out of the well. Where's the science in that? What? There was no science there. That was something a child could figure out. And yet that's what they parade around as the shining example of how the greatness that epidemiology is today. And it's just gone downhill from there. Any remote success that epidemiology's had has been that simple. It doesn't even require science. The other stuff, they keep blowing it. They can't make predictions. They can't get anything right, just like the climate change people. But they sure do affect public policy, don't they? In fact, they take over and dictate public policy without being elected to office. Remember, they are over here, and there's 6 degrees of separation between them, the dictators, and you, the dictated. And in between is this big loaded gun called government. Do you see why they do what they do now? What if you could be the dictator of 7 billion human beings and never even have to be held accountable to the people whose lives you're taking control of? Do a little something for your ego, wouldn't it? Oh, by the way, nothing to do with science there. I didn't even mention science, did I? Learning the truth about the world we live in has nothing to do with science. That's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like what we're talking about junk science here or something. Interesting. Another fella, Ignaz Semmelweis, another example of this. He was a doctor running 2 clinics for childbirth. I think it was in Hungary, and for reasons don't matter, women who were going to have a child, they had to go to these clinics to have the child. They had to go to the government to have their baby. They couldn't do it at home or what have you. Good old government. So the women would go to these, among others, they'd go to these 2 clinics of his. One of the clinics, there was about 18% of the women who died in childbirth, I think, during the winter. And I believe in the summer it was closer to 50%. So like 1 out of 2 women who came in would die having the baby. So the baby grows up without ever knowing its mother. At the other clinic, it was pretty much a straight up 3% all along of the women who died. Now, to this guy's credit, being a doctor, to his credit, he really did care about the women. If you read his writings, it tore at his soul. He didn't understand why one clinic had all these women dying. I mean, the women were coming up with every scheme they could to try not to go to that clinic. To the point of breaking the law, they would have the baby out in the street. I mean, they were just like, you can't drag me to this clinic. It's a death sentence for a mother. But that's medical professionals. That was the doctors. That was the government telling you, you have to go there. You know, the government telling you have to get this vaccine at gunpoint. And these women were just, don't send me there. I don't want to die. I don't want my child to grow up without his mother. Now, again, to this guy's credit, to Semmelweis' credit, he really cared. So he did the same thing. He looked for commonalities. He looked for what might be going on. Well, the first thing he looked at was who's running these clinics. Well, at the clinic where everyone was dying, it was training medical students. It was training doctors, you see. At the other one where they weren't dying, they were training midwives. What could that possibly mean? Well, as it turns out, he did a little more searching. He finally figured out what it was. But again, without science, he just observed things and thought about it, which is where so much of our brilliant science has come from. We don't do that anymore. He figured out that the medical students kept coming into contact with dead people, with cadavers. So they would be sitting there doing an autopsy on a cadaver, and then they would just run over to the next room and help a woman give birth. Right? So he came up with the side, the midwives weren't doing that. All they did was help women give birth. So he thought, well, maybe they're carrying something we can't see from the cadaver to these women that's killing them. Again, they didn't know what germs were. So he put into practice, again, with the chlorine and the water and everything, put into practice to have have everybody wash their hands with this chlorine, you might say today with soap and water, before they help the woman give birth. And guess what? The deaths of the mothers plummeted down to something like 1% all year long. Now here's the catch. So he figured out something absolutely brilliant, something that saves lives. You can't count the number of women who died from this government/medical policy. Wait for my video about health fascism coming up. You're getting a taste of it right now. He came up with an answer, a solution, and he did it without even needing science. He just thought about it like a child would and figured it out. It was that easy. And it worked. Worked brilliantly. Didn't need to pump $20 billion in public funding into it over a 10-year program with PhDs and all. He just did what someone with a brain would do. And he fixed the problem. All you had to do was wash your hands. And by the way, the Bible said to do that 4,000 years ago. The Bible said if you come into contact with a dead body, you are unclean for 7 days. You're supposed to wash yourself with lye after 3 days and then do it again after 7. Lye is basically soap. In other words, the Bible told you how not to go kill the mother when you're giving birth or killing everyone around you after handling a dead body. But they didn't want to listen to the Bible, so 4,000 years later, there they are in Hungary. The doctors and the government are killing all these women. Can't even count how many mothers died, how many children grew up without their mother. So he figures it out, and guess what? The medical profession hates his guts for it. Hates him with a passion. He becomes an outcast immediately. Because A, he's proved that they were killing all these people. They weren't the big-brained people they thought they were. They weren't the height of intellectual evolution that they claimed to be. They weren't that bright, after all. So he showed that, but also the method he used to figure out the problem didn't even require science. Or at least it didn't require what they call science, which is the billions of dollars, the equations, publishing, peer review. He just did what any scientist, real scientist, would start out trying to do. Right? So they hated his guts. The same thing happened with this, what was the name? John Snow, I think, right? With the pump, when Soho, with the cholera epidemic. The doctors did not like the idea of someone coming up with that simple of a solution. So it was a long, years, maybe decades and decades before doctors finally adopted these procedures of just washing your hands before you do surgery on somebody. I mean, and it wasn't because what they were requested to do was unreasonable. Oh, this might help? Well, hey, if it might save just one person, okay, I'll just take 10 seconds to wash my hands between this autopsy and this childbirth. But they wouldn't do that because it struck at their ego. And that's all that matters to these people, not science. I'm not going to wash my hands. What, you think I'm causing this death? No, absolutely not. Forget it. I'm not going to do that. So all these women died. And as they tried to get these policies implemented, Snow and Semmelweis both hit nothing but obstruction from the medical community and the government. Now I want to point out one thing to you here, if I can find it. This is from the Wikipedia entry on epidemiology. Remember what I just told you about what happened. In lieu of time, it says it about both of these gentlemen, but I'm only going to tell you the one about Semmelweis. Okay, Semmelweis. His findings were published, remember, about washing your hands between the autopsy and the childbirth. His findings were published in 1850, but his work was ill-received by his colleagues who discontinued the procedure. Do you see what Wikipedia did here? Or I should say, do you see what the medical community did with Wikipedia since they control this page? I just told you he came up with the simple answer for saving all these lives, and these people wanted to destroy his career. They wanted him shoved out of academic. They wanted these people who figured these things out destroyed. It wasn't just a matter of, no, I'm not going to listen to what you say. They went after him, just like Galileo went to jail for saying that the earth went around the sun. What does Wikipedia say, though? It just says, his work was ill-received by his colleagues. And that's all it says. Ill-received? There's a difference between something being ill-received and an entire industry ganging up to try to destroy your reputation and your career and get you out. Do you see the difference? You see, junk scientists go after people who disagree with them, even when those people are right, because they don't care about the truth. I mentioned that in the last video where I told how to identify a junk scientist. And this is the kind of thing I was talking about. I got no coffee out of that. That's better. Alright. Alright, and again, for time, I can't talk about the coelacanth. Wish I could. Look it up, coelacanth. Look up mastodons, how they died in place with half-digested food in their belly, standing up, buried in permafrost. How does that happen? Well, the boom! Big Bang people and the evolutionists, they've got an answer for everything, don't they? Not a very good answer, though. And when you start looking at science, it starts to look like something else happened. Look it up yourself. Don't have time. I apologize.